The one who can't follow a simple schedule. That's what Dr. Caldwell called her, his voice carrying through Sacred Heart's third-floor ICU like a scalpel finding soft tissue. Brooke Sullivan didn't react. She never did. The other nurses glanced up from their stations, a few exhaled sympathy, one looked away entirely, but Brooke simply continued checking the 4 line on the monitor in front of her, her movement steady as someone threading a needle through silk. They didn't know that being called incompetent was nothing compared to being called a liar. They didn't know that a man's voice raised in anger was a frequency she'd learned to tune out somewhere between Sangin and the medically discharged paperwork that changed her name from major to nurse. What happened next changed everything. It was 23:47 on a Tuesday when the world tilted. Brooke had finished her shift 47 minutes ago, the nursing logs were immaculate, every patient stable, every chart signed and filed with the precision of someone who understood that invisibility required perfection. She should have left. The smart play was to collect her badge from the break room locker, walk out into the Raleigh night where rain was starting to hammer the parking lot, and forget room 347 the way she'd learned to forget everything else. But room 347 held a patient nobody visited. A Marine. Newt. 34 years old according to the chart, though his chart didn't say how he'd lost his words or why he clutched a single dog tag on a broken chain like it was the last thing keeping him tethered to the world. She found him in the dark, the nurses had dimmed his overhead lights 2 hours ago, a mercy the day shift wouldn't have bothered with. The fluorescent bulbs in the hallway cast a pale blue glow through the window, and Brooke could make out the shape of him in the bed, bandages wrapped around his head like he was something that had been put back together and was waiting for someone to check the seams. His right hand lay on top of the blanket, fingers slightly curled. His left arm was immobilized on a pillow, rotator cuff repair from 6 weeks prior, according to the surgical notes. The antiseptic smell of the ICU mixed with something underneath it, something metallic and warm that reminded her of hospital morgues and field triage tents in equal measure. She moved like she always did, no rushing, no wasted motion, the kind of movement that made people forget you were in the room. Brooke pulled the chair from the corner and sat beside the bed, leaving exactly 2 feet of space the way she'd learned to do with combat veterans. Some of them couldn't handle being touched. Some of them couldn't handle anything at all. She didn't speak. Silence was the only language that made sense anymore. The monitors beeped their steady rhythm, heart rate 67, oxygen saturation 98, blood pressure 124/78, all the numbers that said alive, that said stable, that said not gone yet. The Marine's eyes were closed, but Brooke had worked enough trauma cases to know the difference between sleeping and not sleeping. His breathing was too controlled, too aware. His right hand flexed once, then again. The dog tag caught the light as his fingers moved, and Brooke saw it clearly for the first time. Worn smooth. Stamped military issue. No name left legible, just a serial number that had been filed into metal in a compound in Sangin with a training instructor named Hassan and 3 other soldiers who taught her things about survival that no medical school could teach. She recognized that number the way a mother recognizes her child's cry in a crowded room. Not from paperwork. Not from charts. From memory. Her left hand trembled. Just once. Just for a fraction of a second, 3 fingers missing from the blast that had ended everything, the nerve damage making it impossible to hold anything heavier than a stethoscope now, and that tremor was the only thing between her composure and collapse. She tucked her hand into her scrub pocket before anyone could see it. Before she could see it. That was the old life. The real life. The life that came before she became invisible. The Marine's right hand lifted from the blanket. His eyes opened. And he made a gesture, palm up, 2 fingers extended, that meant friend in the hand sign language she'd taught to desperate children in rubble, in compounds, to one 8-year-old boy who'd been holding his sister's body and hadn't spoken since. The silence stretched between them like a rope pulled taut. Brooke's breath caught. She didn't move. She couldn't move. Because that gesture meant he remembered. That gesture meant the boy with the broken voice had become this man with the broken body, and somehow, across 20 years and 10,000 miles and every single lie she'd told to disappear into the wallpaper of Sacred Heart, he recognized her face. The intercom crackled. Nurse Brooke to administration. Yes, the one who can't follow a simple schedule. The words came through with that specific flavor of condescension that only Dr. Caldwell could manufacture, his voice engineered for maximum public humiliation. The ICU nurses looked up. A resident pretended not to hear. Brooke stood with the kind of fluid precision that made young doctors step aside without knowing why, and she straightened the Marine's blanket one more time, a gesture that meant stay, that meant safe, that meant I'm coming back, before she moved toward the door. The hallway was empty except for the fluorescent lights overhead and the soft squeak of her shoes on the tile. She'd walked these corridors for 20 years, and not once had anyone asked why her hands never shook during cardiac arrests, why she could smell infection before the cultures came back, why she moved through crisis like someone who'd been trained in rooms where people died if you hesitated. The administration office was on the second floor. Caldwell was waiting. He was always waiting. The man was a predator who understood that timing was everything, that the best moment to strike was when someone was already off balance, already walking toward you with apologies already forming on their lips. She found him in the supply closet, not the administration office, which meant this was intentional, a staging. The door was propped open just enough. The overhead light cast everything in sharp relief. Caldwell stood with his arms crossed, his white coat pristine, his face arranged into an expression of wounded disappointment that had probably worked on younger nurses, on people who still believed that a man's disapproval was a problem that could be solved. He was 48. Married 3 times. Had written 2 papers on hospital efficiency that had been cited exactly once, by another administrator equally obsessed with cutting costs and cutting staff. "We have a protocol," he said, and his voice was pitched low enough that the hallway monitors couldn't pick it up. "Professional. Quiet. Venomous. You understand protocols, don't you, Brooke? Or am I overestimating your comprehension?" He stepped forward. His finger came up and jabbed once, twice, toward the space between her eyes. "You don't sit with patients past your shift. You don't provide services outside your role. You don't violate the efficiency metrics that keep this hospital running." The finger jabbed again. Close enough that she could smell his aftershave, something expensive that was probably supposed to communicate competence but communicated only desperation. "You are expendable. Do you understand what that word means?" Brooke's jaw clenched. 1 breath. 2. Her hand stayed at her sides, her expression flat as a surgical light, her eyes focused on something behind his face rather than on his face itself. She didn't tremble. She didn't look away. She didn't speak. The silence between them stretched like something alive, something with weight. And for just a moment, Caldwell seemed confused by her lack of reaction, as if he'd expected tears or apologies or some visible sign that his words had penetrated. They hadn't. They'd bounced off something in her that had been reinforced by years of different kinds of chaos, different kinds of fire. "I need you to understand," he continued, his voice dropping even lower, "that you're being watched. Your charts, your hours, your patient interactions. Everything. And if I find one more instance of you violating protocol, I'm recommending your immediate reassignment to float pool status. And from there." He smiled. It was the kind of smile that dogs make when they've cornered something smaller. "From there is up to the board. Clear?" She nodded. 1 movement. No words necessary. Caldwell's finger dropped, and he stepped back into his propriety, his professional demeanor sliding back into place like someone zipping up a jacket over a knife. "Good. Then we understand each other." He turned toward the back of the supply closet, toward the inventory system, already moving on to whatever game he was playing with the next subordinate on his list. Brooke turned toward the door. She walked back into the hallway. The fluorescent lights hummed their constant electrical song. Room 347 was waiting. The Marine with the dog tag and the hand sign for friend. And Brooke Sullivan, invisible for 20 years, took 1 step toward whatever was about to happen, knowing only that she couldn't walk away. Not from this one. Not anymore. The parking lot at shift change looked like every other dawn at Sacred Heart, nurses shuffling toward their cars with the gait of people who'd forgotten what sleep felt like, the sky still dark enough that the sodium lights cast everything in sickly yellow. Dr. Caldwell stood beside a schedule board he'd wheeled outside, the kind usually reserved for unit announcements, and he'd positioned it where the incoming day shift couldn't miss it. Brooke's name had been moved to float pool status in thick black marker, the letters savage and deliberate. He'd timed it perfectly. Shift change was public. Shift change was witnessed. Effective immediately, Caldwell announced, his voice carrying across the parking lot like he was addressing a symposium and not 8 exhausted nurses. Sullivan will be floating to whatever unit needs bodies. No permanent assignment. No patient continuity. He smiled, the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes, the smile of someone who'd learned that cruelty delivered calmly cuts deeper than any shout. Maybe that'll teach her about efficiency. 2 nurses looked away. A resident pretended to check his phone with sudden urgency. One of the night shift nurses who'd been kind to Brooke, had brought her coffee, had covered her breaks, suddenly became very interested in her car door. Brooke stood 15 feet away, her scrubs carrying the layered smell of antiseptic and exhaustion, the fabric still damp from 12 hours of crisis and compromise. She didn't move. Didn't flinch. Didn't give him the reaction he was fishing for, the breaking voice, the reddened face, the hurried exit that would confirm what he'd already decided about her. She took one measured breath instead. Held it for exactly 3 seconds. Then let it out slow enough that it felt intentional, controlled, the way you'd exhale before a difficult procedure, before doing something that required every ounce of precision you possessed. One tear escaped her left eye. Just one. She wiped it with her thumb without breaking eye contact, her hand moving with the same mechanical efficiency she'd used to change a dressing or insert a line. Clinical. Unshakable. "You're so focused on the board's approval," Brooke said, her voice quiet enough that the gathered staff had to lean in to hear it, "you've forgotten what a hospital is for." Caldwell's smile didn't waver. If anything, it widened. "I've forgotten nothing, Sullivan. I've just prioritized what matters, this hospital's financial health. You prioritize feelings." He gestured to the schedule board like it was a work of art. "Guess which one of us has a future here?" She didn't answer. She turned and walked toward her car, each step measured, each movement controlled. A tremor would have felt good. Rage would have felt righteous. But Brooke had learned in Sangin that the most dangerous people are the ones who don't shake. The ones who absorb and catalog and file everything away in that part of the brain that doesn't forget. The one tear had been mercy. She wouldn't allow another. She drove home to her apartment in silence, the morning Raleigh traffic moving like blood through veins, red lights and stop signs marking the path like obstacles in an already rigged course. Her hands on the steering wheel were steady. Had been steady. Would remain steady. She'd learned that steadiness in places where everything was falling apart, where blood looked black in night vision, where children's eyes held adult trauma, where the only thing between a person and permanent damage was someone willing to not fall apart. Her apartment was a study in restraint. No photographs. No mementos. A bed, a desk, a kitchen that rarely saw use. She'd learned how to disappear into spaces the same way she'd learned to disappear in hospitals, make yourself small enough to be useful but not threatening, competent enough to be relied on but not remembered. She changed out of her scrubs methodically, each garment folded instead of discarded, the motions precise enough for a flag ceremony. Then she walked down to the basement laundry room where the industrial machines hummed their monotonous rhythm and the air hung thick with the chemical smell of detergent and heat. The basement was empty at 0730 on a Tuesday morning. This was the time when she'd chosen to do laundry because solitude was strategy and visibility was risk. She loaded her scrubs into the machine, the hospital-issued whites, the compression socks, the undershirts, and poured the detergent with the same measured precision she applied to everything. 1 scoop. No more. Waste was inefficiency, and inefficiency had already cost her everything. The machine roared to life, the tumbler beginning its rotation, and Brooke sat on the concrete step beside the dryer. Her hands hung between her knees. Steady hands. Scarred hands. Hands that had held a child pulled from rubble and told him in broken words that he would survive this, that safety existed somewhere, that she would find a way to make it true. 20 years. 20 years of watching those hands work in hospitals, in clinics, in vehicles racing toward gunfire because that was what you did when people were bleeding and afraid. 20 years of building a civilian life so carefully that no one could trace the seams, could see the combat medic underneath the scrubs, could understand that every choice she'd made had been about penance and presence and the singular focus of taking care of people because she'd failed once, in a compound in Sangin where the walls came down and the dust rose up and a child with eyes like pools of dark water had been placed in her arms. And now she was a float nurse. Now she was unmoored. The tears came then, finally, in the privacy of that basement room where the sound of industrial washing machines would drown out everything else. She didn't fight them. Didn't compose them. They came like a rain she'd been holding back for months, for years, for every single moment she'd had to maintain perfect control. The smell of detergent mixed with salt. The fluorescent lights above hummed their perpetual song. Her hands pressed against her knees and finally, she let herself break the way people broke when everything they'd built was demolished by someone who saw them as expendable. She didn't know how long she sat there. Time worked differently in moments like this, could have been 5 minutes or 50. What she did know was that her phone buzzed at some point, pulled her back to the surface like a tether. A text from Jenna, the night charge nurse who'd become something close to a friend. They're moving him at 1100. Psych transport already called. Brooke's breath caught. She read the message 3 times, each word landing like a punch. Room 347. The Marine with the mute voice and the desperate eyes. The dog tag he'd pressed into her hand during that final moment before Caldwell had ambushed her in the supply closet, his eyes trying to communicate something she understood without words. She reached for her pocket where she'd palmed it, a single dog tag on a broken chain, the metal worn thin from decades of carrying weight. The serial number read like a prayer she no longer believed in, 2847 A Delta A K. The designation she'd filed for an 8-year-old boy pulled from rubble in a compound outside Sangin, a child who'd lost everything when the walls came down, who'd looked at her with those same dark, desperate eyes and managed to sign the word friend using movements his broken arm couldn't quite complete. She'd given him her spare dog tag against regulations, against every protocol, against the direct order that medical personnel maintain professional distance and emotional neutrality. She'd taken it from around her own neck, still warm from her skin, and pressed it into his small hand and told him in broken Pashto that it would keep him safe, that he should wear it until he was strong enough to protect others, that she would find a way to make it true. She'd been a major then, too. A very different kind of nurse. The dog tag hung from a chain that had been broken for months. She'd never had it repaired because the break seemed appropriate somehow, seemed to match the damage that couldn't be fixed with solder and replacement links. The metal was warm in her hand now, and she understood with absolute clarity that if they transferred him to psychiatric, if they moved him to long-term care, if Caldwell succeeded in erasing what little continuity existed between them, she might never see him again. The laundry room hummed around her. The basement held its breath. And Brooke, sitting in the basement of the hospital that was supposed to be her redemption, holding a dog tag that belonged to a child she couldn't save but had somehow kept alive anyway, made a decision that would reshape everything that came next. The basement laundry room fell silent except for the industrial dryer's mechanical heartbeat. Brooke sat on the concrete floor, still in her scrubs, the dog tag pressed against her palm like a prayer someone had already answered. 6 hours until the day shift arrived. She had time to decide if she was going to quit, or if quitting was just another way of abandoning someone. Her phone buzzed at 0245. Unknown number. Unknown text, patient room 347 deteriorating. Vitals dropping. Night shift nurse requesting you. Don't tell Caldwell. Brooke's jaw tightened. She didn't move. She didn't call back. She sat there for exactly 8 seconds, watching the dog tag catch the fluorescent light, and then she stood. Her legs moved before her mind caught up, hospital stairs, 3rd floor, the ICU corridor that should have been locked to her now, but protocols had gaps the size of Sangin if you knew where to look. Room 347's door hung slightly open. Inside, the monitors screamed. BP 70 over 40 and dropping. O2 sat 71 and falling. The Marine's lips had turned the color of old pennies. His body convulsed against the bed rails, seizure activity that meant his brain was suffocating, that meant minutes, not hours, before irreversible damage. Dr. Marcus Chen stood frozen at the foot of the bed, still in yesterday's scrubs, pale as the 4 bag hanging above his head. 6 months out of med school. Night shift resident. The kind of physician who had learned medicine from textbooks but not from watching people die. "We need to intubate," Chen said to no one. "We need CT, we need a surgeon, we need..." "Tension pneumothorax," Brooke said quietly from the doorway. Chen's head snapped toward her. "Who are?" the night nurse said someone might. His lung collapsed. Air's compressing his heart against the other side of his chest. It's a one-way valve. He can't breathe out anymore. Brooke moved past Chen without waiting for acknowledgement. The monitors beeped in rhythm with the seizure. "He needs immediate decompression or he dies in the next 90 seconds. We need imaging confirmation, we need a needle in his chest in 60 seconds or brain death is permanent." She didn't ask permission. Permission was for people who had the luxury of waiting. Brooke's hands were already moving through the supply cabinet, pulling a 14-gauge needle from the trauma kit, finding for tubing she could repurpose as a one-way valve. Sacred Heart Supply Room didn't stock proper chest seals, budget cuts that Caldwell had personally approved. But Brooke's locker, buried under spare uniforms, held something else, MRE packages from 2004. Combat ration she'd never thrown away, a habit from Sangin that her body had never let her stop. She tore open a flameless ration heater packet, kept the plastic backing, created an improvised seal that would let air escape but not re-enter. Chen watched with the expression of someone watching a magician reveal sleight of hand. The Marine's O2 sat dropped to 68. His skin had gone mottled, the color of a bruise spreading across his chest. Brooke prepped the site with trembling fingers, not fear, restraint, and found the landmarks her hands remembered: second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, the exact angle that would slip between the ribs without hitting bone. She inserted the needle with the precision of muscle memory refined across 17 combat missions. The hiss of air escaping was immediate. Sharp. The sound of internal pressure releasing, of physics saving a life. The Marine's oxygen saturation climbed, 74. 79, 85. 91, his color returned like someone had switched a light back on inside his chest. The seizure activity stopped. His body went slack against the mattress, unconscious but breathing, blood pressure climbing steadily, 78, 82, 88, finally stabilizing at 96 over 62. Chen stumbled backward. How did you even know? But the ICU's glass partition door swung open and Dr. Caldwell stood in the frame, still wearing his board meeting clothes, a charcoal suit that probably cost more than Brooke's monthly rent. The code alert on the overhead page must have drawn him back, curiosity pulling him like a shark detecting blood in water. He saw Brooke. Saw the improvised equipment. Saw the MRE packaging on the bedside table. His face shifted through 3 expressions in 5 seconds: confusion, calculation, and then something colder. The look of someone who'd just found ammunition and was already loading the weapon. "What the hell is happening in my ICU?" His voice was steady. That was the dangerous part, not the anger, but the absence of it. "Dr. Chen, document everything you just witnessed. Every single detail. Nurse Sullivan, step away from the patient. Now." Brooke stepped back. She didn't argue. The Marine's chest rose and fell. The monitors beat their rhythm, steady and normal and alive. That was the mission. That was always the mission. Caldwell pulled his phone from his jacket pocket and moved to the hallway. 3 phone calls, each one audible through the glass partition because he wanted her to hear. First to the chief medical officer: "I need to report a serious credentialing violation." A floor nurse just performed an unauthorized emergency procedure using improvised equipment. The CMO's voice, tinny through the phone speaker, asking questions that Caldwell answered with precision, each answer designed to sound worse than the last. Second call to the hospital board member whose name Brooke had heard mentioned in supply closet whispers. Richard, this involves liability exposure. A nurse with undisclosed medical training performed an unauthorized needle decompression in my ICU. We need to secure her employment file immediately and contact legal. The third call went to HR. Caldwell's voice never raised. He didn't need to yell. He'd learned something far more effective, the quiet voice of institutional power. I need an emergency credentialing review. Begin it now. No, tonight. The employee in question has falsified her application by omitting significant medical training. Yes, I understand the implications. He hung up and turned back to face her through the glass. He didn't smile. He didn't need to. His expression carried the weight of someone who'd just set something in motion that couldn't be stopped. Your access to this ward is suspended effective immediately, Caldwell said, his voice cutting through the monitor noise like a knife finding the exact space between ribs. You're confined to the pediatric float pool until HR completes their investigation. Anyone found assisting you or providing you information will face similar consequences. Are we clear? Brooke didn't nod. Didn't shake her head. She turned and walked past him with the kind of measured stride that came from knowing the difference between running and retreating. The hospital corridor stretched in both directions, fluorescent and empty and endless. She heard Chen calling behind her, "Thank you. I don't know how you knew, but thank you." But Caldwell's voice cut him off. "Dr. Chen, we're going to have a long conversation about appropriate medical protocols." The stairs down from the third floor felt longer than the climb up. Brooke's hands were steady. Her heart rate was elevated but controlled, the kind of elevated that came from action, not fear. She'd saved the Marine. The procedure would be questioned, the training would be explained away, the whole thing would become ammunition for something Caldwell was already constructing in his mind. But the Marine had breathed. The Marine had lived through another night. The dog tag was still in her pocket, pressed against her sternum like a second heartbeat, and Brooke Sullivan, Major Sullivan, the woman who'd trained medics in Sangin, who'd performed field surgery under fire, who'd made impossible decisions in moments when there was no time for doubt, walked out into the pre-dawn darkness of Raleigh and wondered how long she had before everything she'd carefully hidden came crashing down. The cardiac monitor's steady beep turned flat at 0312. Dr. Caldwell arrived at Sacred Heart's ICU 3 minutes later, expecting to find chaos. Instead, he found Brooke Sullivan standing calmly beside the Marine in room 347, the patient's oxygen saturation climbing steadily on the monitor, 78%. 82%. 86%. The needle decompression had worked. The tension pneumothorax was resolved. The Marine was breathing. Caldwell's jaw tightened as he took in the scene, the improvised chest seal fashioned from an MRE heating element and surgical tape, the sterile technique despite the lack of authorization, the absolute competence of a woman he'd been systematically dismantling for weeks. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Instead, he pulled out his phone and stepped into the corridor, his fingers moving with surgical precision across the screen. 3 calls. The first to board member Richardson at 0317. The second to board member Chen at 0319. The third to the hospital's chief legal officer at 0322. By 0330, before the night shift change, the machinery of institutional power was already grinding into motion. Caldwell's voice remained level throughout each call, his words carefully chosen. "I need to discuss a compliance matter regarding one of our nursing staff. A credentialing issue. Yes, tonight. Before she leaves the building." The reassignments began at 0345. Jenna, the night supervisor who'd watched Brooke save the Marine's life, suddenly found herself reassigned to the pediatric unit for the next 2 weeks, a staffing need that Caldwell personally authorized. The respiratory therapist who'd arrived seconds after Brooke started the decompression? Transferred to the day shift. The resident who'd frozen and stepped back, allowing Brooke to take over, received a text about a mandatory training session in the East Wing that would keep him away from the ICU during the critical morning window. By the time dawn broke over Raleigh, every witness to Brooke's medical knowledge had been carefully scattered across different departments, different floors, different schedules. Caldwell had learned long ago that the most effective silencing wasn't done with volume, it was done with logistics. At 0900, Caldwell's assistant summoned Brooke to the administrative conference room on the 3rd floor. No page, no overhead announcement. Just a quiet message delivered by a junior clerk: "Dr. Caldwell needs to see you." She knew. The way her shoulders tensed for exactly 1 second told him she understood the machinery had already begun to turn. She walked to the conference room with the same measured pace she used in the ICU, no hurrying, no stumbling, the gait of someone walking toward something inevitable. HR Director Patricia Vance was already seated at the polished conference table when Brooke entered, a disciplinary folder positioned precisely in front of her. Caldwell gestured to a chair across from them both. The room smelled like furniture polish and the faint chemical tang of the building's ventilation system. "You performed an invasive procedure without physician authorization," Caldwell began, his voice carrying the practiced calm of someone reading a lab report. "You accessed areas of the hospital you were explicitly restricted from following your reassignment. You used equipment in violation of multiple protocols." He didn't make it a question. Brooke sat with her hands folded on the table, and Caldwell noticed something he'd never paid attention to before: 3 fingers missing on her left hand, the remaining digits scarred and precise. The old wound of someone accustomed to loss. She said nothing. Vance opened the folder with the soft whisper of pages turning. "We need to verify your credentials, Ms. Sullivan. Your employment application from 20 years ago lists your nursing degree but doesn't mention any prior medical training. Where did you learn advanced trauma procedures?" The question hung in the air like a test. A trap. A moment where Brooke could either lie or confess, and either choice would destroy her. She inhaled once, steady as a metronome. "I had prior training," she said carefully, each word measured. "It wasn't relevant to the position I applied for." Caldwell smiled. It was a small smile, the smile of someone who'd just received exactly what he needed. "That sounds like an admission of falsifying your application. Failure to disclose relevant credentials is grounds for immediate termination." He slid a printed form across the polished surface of the table. The paper hissed as it moved. "Pending a formal investigation into credentialing fraud, your badge access is suspended effective immediately. You're placed on administrative leave without pay. Security will escort you to collect your personal belongings." Brooke's eyes dropped to the form for a single second. She didn't touch it. "You're doing this because I saved a patient's life," she said quietly. Not a question either. Caldwell leaned back in his chair. "I'm doing this because you violated hospital protocol and then lied about your qualifications." The distinction was razor-thin and completely false. Both of them knew it. The escort happened at 1300, a young security guard named Marcus who looked genuinely uncomfortable as he followed Brooke through Sacred Heart's corridors. She opened her locker, the same locker she'd used for 20 years, and collected her life in 10 minutes. A photo from nursing school graduation, her face unsmiling and serious. A coffee mug from the night shift Christmas party 6 years ago. The MRE packages she kept in the back for the long shifts. The dog tag stayed in her pocket, pressed against her sternum like a second heartbeat. Caldwell watched from the nurse's station, his arms crossed, his expression blank. He couldn't resist orchestrating one final move, the perfect punctuation to her removal. At 13:30, he paged the social worker with direct orders: transfer the Marine in room 347 to psychiatric long-term care. Arrange it for 1600. The timeline was deliberate. By the time Brooke might have heard about it, it would be done. The patient would be gone. The evidence of her competence would be relocated to another facility, another floor of bureaucracy. The basement laundry room at 1430 was where rock bottom lived. Brooke folded her scrubs, 20 years of night shifts, emergency calls, lives held in her steady hands, with the precise movements of someone who'd spent her youth folding flags. Sleeves aligned perfectly. Creases sharp as knife edges. The industrial washers hummed their metallic song, and the smell of detergent mixed with bleach and something deeper, something salt-sharp from the tears she finally allowed herself to shed. Her shoulders moved as she folded. Her breathing came in careful pulls. The dog tag clinked softly against the metal folding chair, the only sound louder than the washers. She sat there at 1500, surrounded by perfectly folded scrubs, and the laundry supervisor, an older woman named Rosa who'd worked in this basement for 30 years, found her and didn't ask questions. Rosa just squeezed Brooke's shoulder and left because some things don't need words. But that wasn't the moment everything changed. That wasn't the final act. Because at 15:45, the sound that pulled Brooke's head up from her hands wasn't from the laundry room. It came from above, a deep rhythmic percussion that made the fluorescent lights flicker. The sound of rotor blades. The sound of a helicopter. Raleigh's airspace above Sacred Heart Hospital suddenly filled with the unmistakable thud-thud-thud of a military transport, and the security guards on the rooftop scrambled to open the helipad access doors. Caldwell ran from his office at the first sound of the rotors. He reached the third-floor window and watched, his face draining of color as 6 figures in dress blue uniforms descended from the aircraft, Force Recon Marines in full ceremonial gear, moving with the fluid precision of trained operators. The SEAL team leader came first, his chest a constellation of ribbons, and he moved through Sacred Heart's main entrance like someone entering a location he'd already studied on satellite imagery. "We're here for Major Sullivan," he announced to the stunned security guard at the main desk. His voice carried the particular authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed immediately. "Major Brooke Sullivan." "Where is she?" Caldwell intercepted them in the corridor, his administrator voice activated like a defense mechanism. "I'm Dr. Caldwell, Chief of Medicine. There's no Major Sullivan employed here. We have a Brooke Sullivan, but she's a floor nurse currently under Major," the SEAL interrupted, his tone suggesting this was a correction Caldwell needed. "Not nurse. Major." The Marine from room 347 stood among them, still wearing the hospital-issued gown under a hastily arranged uniform jacket, his face bearing the pallor of recent critical illness. But his eyes burned. His voice rasped, damaged by whatever injury had stolen his words, but functional, and it carried the weight of recognition. "My Major. Where is my Major?" Security retrieved Brooke from the basement at the SEAL team leader's insistent request. She emerged into the main corridor still wearing her scrubs, and the gathered crowd, nurses, residents, maintenance staff, patients who'd wandered from their rooms, created a corridor of silence. The SEAL handed her a file retrieved from hospital archives. Brooke's hands remained steady as she opened it. The photo showed her younger, harder, wearing Special Forces insignia. Her name was printed beneath it, Major Brooke Sullivan, combat medical badge prominently displayed. "Silver Star," the SEAL team leader began, reading from memory, his voice filling the hospital corridor like a formal recitation, "for actions under direct fire in Sangin Province, 2004. Gasps spread through the gathered staff like ripples. Purple Heart for injury sustained during enemy engagement." The Marine stepped forward, still holding the dog tag on the broken chain. His voice cracked but carried absolute clarity. "She gave me this when I was 8. My village. The compound collapsed during an airstrike. My family died. She pulled me from the rubble. She splinted my arm with an MRE package in her belt and told me this would keep me safe until I was strong enough to protect others." Caldwell tried to speak. His mouth opened. Nothing emerged that sounded like words. The SEAL continued without pause, his gaze fixed on Caldwell's face. "The woman you fired today saved 37 lives in a single engagement. She held a position alone for 6 hours while evacuating wounded personnel. She lost 3 fingers when she shielded a translator from a fragmentation grenade." The dog tag clinked softly as the Marine lifted it higher. Around Caldwell, nurses were openly crying. Residents were photographing the personnel file on their phones. The Marine's voice steadied as he looked directly at Brooke. "Welcome home, Major." The Chinook descended through Raleigh's afternoon sky at 1,545 hours, rotors churning the air into submission, and the ground beneath Sacred Heart's helipad trembled like the earth itself recognized what was coming. Security tried to stop them at the main entrance, 3 guards who'd never seen force-reckon Marines move with that particular kind of purpose, but the lead operator simply said, "Stand down," and they did, because some men carry authority the way other men carry weapons. The team moved through the lobby in formation, dress uniforms sharp as blades, and the waiting room fell silent the way a forest goes silent when apex predators pass through. They asked for her by rank, not name. "We're looking for Major Sullivan." The charge nurse at the desk made a sound like air escaping a tire. She's not on duty." "We know where she is," the SEAL team leader said. It wasn't a request. It was a command. Brooke was in the basement, folding scrubs that no longer belonged to her, when her phone vibrated with a text from Marcus Chen in pediatrics. "Something's happening upstairs. Military. Asking for you by rank." She didn't move for 3 seconds. Time compressed. The smell of industrial detergent and her own resignation seemed to crystallize in that moment, and then muscle memory took over, the same muscle memory that once kept her alive in Sangin. She climbed the stairs. The ICU hallway looked different now. Packed. Security standing useless at the perimeter. And in the center of it all, in dress blue so crisp they looked like they'd been painted on, stood the Marine from room 347. His voice had been gone for 6 months, stolen by whatever trauma had wired his throat shut. But as Brooke emerged from the stairwell, his lips moved, and sound emerged, rough, barely there, but unmistakable, "My Major." The room went dead silent. She didn't flinch. She didn't acknowledge the gathering crowd or the cameras that security was already trying to remove. She stepped forward, one measured step, and the Marine straightened, the movement precise, military, the salute not quite formed but the intention there. His right hand trembled slightly as he reached into his pocket and withdrew the dog tag. Single. Tarnished. The chain was broken. "She gave me this," he said, his voice climbing slightly, finding strength in the speaking of truth. "When I was 8 years old. I was in rubble. Sangin." Everyone was screaming. He held it up, and the morning light caught the metal. She said, "This will keep you safe until you're strong enough to protect others." He paused, breathing through the effort of all those words. "Yesterday, she saved my life again. And tonight, she gave me permission to tell you who she is." Dr. Caldwell appeared at the far end of the hallway, his face doing something it had never done before, blanking. Going white in the way skin does when the blood decides it needs to be somewhere else. Behind him, the chief medical officer emerged with a lawyer whose expression suggested she'd already reviewed the depositions and calculated the hospital's exposure. The SEAL team leader stepped forward, and his presence moved through the space like gravity shifting. He was tall the way granite cliffs are tall, not just size but density, the kind of man who'd learned to move through the world at a specific angle. "I'm Commander Hayes," he said. 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines. Dark Horse. He turned to the crowd, and his voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being heard over aircraft engines. "The woman you're about to meet holds the Silver Star for Valor Under Fire. The Purple Heart, twice. The Combat Medical Badge. And according to 37 confirmed reports from Sangin province in 2004, she saved 37 lives performing emergency field medicine under sustained enemy fire." Each sentence landed like a percussion strike. She was medically discharged with full honors. And someone in this hospital decided that made her expendable. Caldwell's mouth opened. Closed. Opened again. "We have protocols." "I know what you have," Commander Hayes said quietly. "I read your employment application. It asked for medical credentials and nursing licenses. Nothing else." Major Sullivan provided both. She committed no fraud. She violated no law. The only thing she violated was your corporate efficiency quota. He turned to the chief medical officer. "How long before the Department of Defense contacts you about a wrongful termination claim?" The CMO's attorney whispered something. The CMO's face suggested it was a number in the millions. What happened next didn't just silence the room, it compressed time itself. The Marine held up the dog tag again, and Brooke finally moved. She reached out, one hand extending, and her own dog tag emerged from beneath her shirt. The matching piece. They'd been separated for 20 years. When the two tags connected, the sound was small, a metallic clink barely audible above the fluorescent hum, but it echoed through the hallway like a gavel falling. A trembling charge nurse approached Brooke holding a manila folder. Her hand shook as she extended it. Inside was a personnel file with a photograph, younger Brooke, hair shorter, eyes harder, wearing dress blues that fit like they'd been made for combat. The document stacked beneath showed the architecture of a life nobody had known she lived. Bronze Star citation. Silver Star citation. 2 Purple Heart entries. Combat Medical Badge. 37 confirmed saves. Unit commendations from the 75th Ranger Regiment. Medical discharge papers signed by a 2-star general. Caldwell tried to speak again. This doesn't change the credentialing issue. Commander Hayes didn't even look at him. Major Sullivan never listed credentials she didn't have. She never claimed qualifications she hadn't earned. She worked as an RN for 20 years because that's what her application asked for. His voice descended into the register that men use when they're explaining something for the last time. What she did yesterday, the life-saving procedure, she performed that using field medicine training she earned under fire. Training she earned the right to use with her own blood. And you fired her for saving a Marine's life. The second Marine stepped forward, the one who'd been standing with Commander Hayes. His uniform bore a unit patch, 1st SFOD Delta. He was younger, maybe 30, and he wore the expression of someone who'd already died once and had made peace with the logistics. She held a position under fire for 6 hours so we could extract wounded, he said. Full stop. No politics. No efficiency metrics. Just holding the line. He paused. Then she did it again yesterday, just in a different uniform. The board convened at 1700 in a conference room that suddenly felt too small. The chief medical officer entered with her attorney, and the temperature in the space shifted the way it does when lawyers bring paperwork. We've been contacted by the Department of Defense, the CMO said quietly. They're asking why we terminated a decorated combat veteran for performing life-saving care. She opened her laptop. They're also asking about our pattern of terminating female nursing staff. 3 complaints in the past 5 years. All of whom reported similar treatment from Dr. Caldwell. Caldwell's attorney, whom he'd called at 16:30, sat beside him, already calculating odds. The hospital's legal counsel spread documents across the table, Brooke's original application, the job description, state licensing requirements. The application asked for relevant medical credentials and nursing licenses. It did not require disclosure of military service. Major Sullivan listed her nursing degree. Her RN license. She answered accurately. The attorney paused. We have zero legal basis for termination on fraud grounds. Margaret Chen, the finance chair who'd enthusiastically backed Caldwell's efficiency protocols, shifted uncomfortably in her seat. The optics, she said slowly, are catastrophic. We fired a Silver Star recipient. By 1800, Caldwell made the decision that would end his career, though he didn't know it yet. He contacted WIL News in Raleigh, pitching himself as the vigilant administrator who'd caught a dangerous deception. The reporter bit immediately. By 1830, Caldwell sat in Sacred Heart's empty conference room, already sweating under the studio lights, explaining why he'd terminated a nurse for misrepresenting credentials. We take patient safety seriously, he said. When we discovered a nurse had performed unauthorized procedures, we had no choice but to dismiss her. It's unfortunate, but protocols exist for a reason. The anchor leaned forward. Can you confirm this nurse is a veteran? Caldwell nodded, the fatal move. Yes, which makes it more disappointing. We support our veterans, but... This is Lieutenant General David Martinez, U.S. Marine Corps, a voice said over the phone line, and the studio went still in the way rooms go still when a 3-star general enters uninvited. Are you referring to Major Brooke Sullivan, who holds the combat medical badge and saved my son's life in Sangin province? Or is there some other decorated veteran you're slandering on national television? Caldwell's face on the split-screen monitor drained of color entirely. Because my son is standing right here, General Martinez continued. And according to him, Major Sullivan saved his life twice. Once 20 years ago, and again yesterday, using the same training and the same instinct that earned her the Silver Star. The general's voice descended. The hospital that fired her should be ashamed. The phones exploded. Social media erupted within minutes. #Justice for Major Sullivan trended locally within an hour. By 2000, the board had called Caldwell back for an emergency meeting, this time with lawyers and PR consultants whose expressions suggested they were already calculating the hospital's liability exposure in 8 figures. Margaret Chen's voice was ice. You went on television and slandered a Silver Star recipient without verifying facts. You've made us a national embarrassment. Caldwell tried to deflect. I was protecting. You've created liability, the legal counsel interrupted. Wrongful termination. Defamation. Potential violations of veterans' employment protections. You've exposed us to millions in damages. By 2100, his hospital access was suspended pending review. By 2200, news crews camped outside his home. By midnight, the North Carolina Medical Board announced an investigation into his conduct. The suspension became permanent after they found a pattern, 3 previous patient complaints buried, metrics prioritized over care, a history of targeting female staff who challenged his efficiency protocols. 6 months later, Brooke stood at the podium in Sacred Heart's new Veteran Trauma Program ceremony, dress uniform crisp, 3 fingers missing from her left hand, the price she'd paid in Sangin, holding the microphone steady in her right. The Marine stood beside her, her dog tag around his neck, his voice fully returned, working as the program's peer support coordinator. The waiting room displayed a photograph, young Major Sullivan in Sangin, surrounded by children, the caption reading some debts take 20 years to repay. Caldwell's story ended differently. He was filmed by a local news crew selling supplemental insurance policies from a folding table outside a strip mall on Capitol Boulevard. The reporter asked if he had comment about Major Sullivan's program. His face angled away as 2 Marines in dress blues walked past, one pausing to read his name tag before shaking his head and continuing on. Brooke gave the closing address to the new nursing cohort. She held up an MRE package, framed now, the one she'd used for the improvised chest seal, and told them about the 8-year-old boy in rubble who became the Marine who found her again. I spent 20 years hiding who I was because I thought my value was in being invisible. It took losing everything to remember that some fights are worth being seen for. She paused. The quietest person in the room might be holding it all together. Don't mistake silence for absence. Don't mistake humility for weakness. If you found yourself rooting for Brooke, subscribe and share this video. And ask yourself, have you ever underestimated someone who turned out to be exactly what you needed?